So today we're starting in part 3 of the course, which I call the end of history. And the end of history harkened back to the book, The End of History, that we talked about earlier, was this idea that democracy and liberal institutions and market capitalism had come to the world to stay. It was embodied in the neoliberal consensus at home and the Washington consensus abroad. And as I have said several times, I'm calling this the early post-Cold War period. And so when I talk about the end of history, when did the end of history happen in the US? And the truth is it didn't happen all at once, and it was a bit like turning around a massive ocean liner at sea. I would say that in the full consciousness of mainstream elites, it really ended with a bang with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Even after Brexit, many people in America didn't think that was heralding something that might be happening here. So I think that, but then when that happened, I think people started to realize we were living in a different world than the comfortable world of the end of history that we had come to identify. But if you want to say when did it really start ending, as opposed to when did people realize it was ending, I think that there's a kind of bifurcation. At home, it really starts, I've dated it to the collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 15th of 2008, which was the beginning of the financial crisis, which was going to have huge knock-on effects for America's place in the global economy, for the Washington consensus. There was going to be this big retreat. Russia and China, as we're going to talk about this time next week, would fill a big part of the void as the Washington consensus went home, or as the purveyors of the Washington consensus went home and the consensus itself started to disintegrate. We started hearing about the Beijing consensus and alternative development models and so on. So I think that was the beginning of the collapse at home. Abroad, when we think about geopolitics rather than economics, really it begins with, I've dated it to the day before the invasion of Iraq, so March 19th, 2003, because I think that that was probably the high point of American global geopolitical influence in the world for reasons that I'll talk about today. So a little taking stock. The Cold War had been won, first of all, at a surprisingly low cost. The Soviet Union had knelt down and died. There was no big war. It was a fairly peaceful transition. And in terms of blood and treasure, much less than people might have anticipated. The 1990s and early 2000s, as I've just said, were the heyday of the Washington consensus, and democracy seemed to be on the march. To remind you of a statistic I told you about earlier, as at the turn of the 21st century, for the first time in human history, there were more democracies in the world than non-democracies. So there's a lot of confidence in that. 9/11 gave the US huge leeway to act internationally. There was a very broad perception that we had been a victim of an unjustified terrorist attack, not universal, but extremely broad consensus, and that the US certainly was going to do what was necessary to chase down the terrorists that had attacked us, and nobody was going to second guess that move that we began in Afghanistan, even if, as it turned out later, there were paths not taken and things that might have been done differently. But it was a time of unprecedented self-confidence in America's capacity to shape the world. And perhaps this video of George W. Bush on the 1st of May, 2003 encapsulates that self-confidence about as well as anybody could.
Any outlaw regime that has ties to terrorist groups and seeks or possesses weapons of mass destruction is a grave danger to the civilized world and will be confronted. We've begun the search for hidden chemical and biological weapons and already know of hundreds of sites that will be investigated.
Nice, you like it? Yeah, fantastic.
The transition from dictatorship to democracy will take time, but it is worth every effort. Our coalition will stay until our work is done.
So that sums it up. And another remarkable statement of this was this was a comment made by an anonymous White House aide, turned out later to be Karl Rove, to Ron Suskind, the journalist, in October of 2004. He had been complaining about a story that Suskind had written about Karen Hughes, who had been the White House press secretary. So Rove said to Suskind, "You people seem to think that we have to start with reality. But we're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to study what we do." Right? So it's hard to say anything stronger than that about confidence in America's capacity to shape reality. And just again, to make the contrast, let's go back and see what George W. Bush was saying about U.S. global strategic ambitions and practices 3 years earlier when he was running for the presidency.
Are we going to step up to the plate as a nation, the way we did after World War II? The way that generation of heroes said, okay, the United States is going to be the leader. And the world benefited tremendously from the courage that they showed in those post-war years.
I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be. Because I am worried about overcommitting our military around the world. I want to be judicious in its use. I just don't think it's the role of the United States to walk into a country and say, we do it this way, so should you. If we're an arrogant nation, they'll resent us. If we're a humble nation but strong, they'll welcome us. And our nation stands alone right now in the world in terms of power. And that's why we've got to be humble. If we're an arrogant nation, they'll view us that way. But if we're a humble nation, they'll respect us. And so I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building. I think what we need to do is convince people who live in the lands they live in to build the nations. Maybe I'm missing something here. I mean, we're going to have kind of a nation-building corps. I'm concerned that we're over-deployed around the world. I don't want to be the world's policeman. And the exit strategy needs to be well-defined.
So what we see between that speech in 2000, or those various clips from 2000, and the speech I showed you last time from Rumsfeld, and the mission accomplished speech, and the Rove's attitude is a more or less complete takeover of the Republican administration by the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party. Now, I have talked about neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism being the commitment to the trifecta of low regulation, free trade, and privatization, but I haven't talked about neoconservatism yet in this course, and I'm here talking about today the demise of the neoconservative dream. But we need to be clear on, well, who were the neoconservatives and what did they actually, what was their dream that demised or came to its demise. So here's some reflections by Irving Kristol, who is widely known as the godfather of neoconservatism.
Irving Kristol, author of the autobiography of an idea, Neoconservatism. When was the first time you ever heard that word uttered?
It must have been sometime in the mid-1970s. It was not my term. I did not invent it. I believe it was invented by someone who was criticizing me. And I thought that that was a term of opprobrium. I decided that it was a pretty good description of, in fact, what I was thinking and feeling, so I ran with it.
What does it mean?
What it means is that it refers to a constellation of opinions and views that is not traditionally conservative, but is conservative, and is certainly not liberal. Things, particularly intellectual political things, intellectual and political ideas, were more in flux in the 1970s than either before or after. I mean, that was the decade of transition so far as I was concerned. You know, in 1968, I still voted for Hewitt Humphrey. But by 1974, I realized I was going to become a Republican. And by that time, the term neoconservatism had been invented, and I decided I was also a neoconservative.
You say that you've been a neo-Marxist, a neo-Trotskyist, a neo-socialist, a neo-liberal, and finally a neoconservative.
That pretty much traces the trajectory of my political beliefs. I've never been comfortable with any of those doctrines because I always saw problems inherent in those doctrines. Those who would 10 years ago have been called neoconservatives, these days simply call themselves conservatives. The conservative movement has expanded to include us.
So there it is. Now you know what neoconservatism was. In fact, you can watch that entire interview from which I excerpted 3 minutes and still not be able to glean. You can glean what it wasn't, but it's very hard to get a sense of what it was. But he nonetheless tells us a couple of important things about neoconservatism that I think give clues to what it was. To start at the end, it was clearly something that had gone mainstream by the time he was talking in 1995. So as he said, people were no longer talking about neoconservatism as different from mainstream conservatism by then. But then the second clue is his own personal history. He started out on the left, actually, as a kind of Trotskyist critic of the Soviet Union before World War II, as information was coming out on the left. People like the Webbs and others in the UK, there started to be a left critique of the Soviet Union. And so the people who ultimately became the neoconservatives sometimes were called liberal hawks. And they very much, another one much later, actually, people called Christopher Hitchens a neoconservative for his support for the Iraq War. So it had a long lineage, and its roots were in the pre-World War II criticism of the USSR. And in the 60s and 70s, it was fueled by people, a lot of whom had started out in the sort of Scoop Jackson Democrats who didn't like the peace movement, didn't like the peaceniks, didn't like the New Left, didn't like the 60s, and all of that. And they tended to ally themselves with the proponents of rollback in various administrations, so in Republican administrations. And they certainly were a lot closer to Nixon's policies than they were to the Democrats who came subsequently. So they were for aggressive prosecution of the Cold War, staunchly anti-communist and anti-socialist. In the post-Cold War period, of course, like everyone else, the neoconservatives were rethinking what their views should be in this new world. Since their sort of raison d'etre for decades had been virulent anti-communism, and communism, for all practical purposes, had gone away. And this is when the neoconservatives, I think, started to differentiate themselves from other conservatives, certainly from libertarian conservatives and people who would subsequently, critics of theirs, come to be called paleoconservatives, or to call themselves paleoconservatives because they didn't like being identified with the neoconservative label. And the distinctive feature of the post-Cold War neoconservatives were two, I think. One is that they wanted to spread democracy around the world. They were interested in knocking off non-democratic regimes. But they also didn't doubt for a second that democratic regimes would be pro-American. So they really were, if you like, we might say today, drinking the Kool-Aid of the early post-Cold War consensus. But they thought that installing democracy in the Middle East or anywhere else would automatically produce regimes that were friendly to the US. And indeed, just to give two illustrations of that, in one of their justifications for the invasion of Iraq was that it would be a positive domino process. We would democratize Iraq, and we would get friendly Western-style regime there, and then that would have knock-on effects either. And partly because that didn't happen, there was huge pressure to conduct elections in Lebanon, even though all the experts were telling them it would actually strengthen the position of the anti-American militias. Or you can see in 2005 and 6, they pushed strongly for elections in the West Bank and Gaza, and were stunned when Hamas won the elections in Gaza. So there'd been this expectation, not only is it easy to implant democracy, but democracies will tend to see the US as a benign force and will be pro-American. And there were people like Elliott Abrams, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and Cheney, who had been in the as Defense Secretary in George Herbert Walker Bush's administration, and would come back with George W. Bush and, of course, Donald Rumsfeld. And if you want to find a sort of defining example of neoconservative thinking, it's this document published in 1995 called From Containment to Global Leadership, America and the World After the Cold War, written by this man, Khalilzad, who is currently, by the way, Pompeo's envoy to Afghanistan, and he served in multiple administrations in various capacities. But he produced this document in 1995, basically in which he said, in the post-Cold War era, America's got three options geopolitically. It can go back to isolationism. He called it neo-isolationism. People like this neo word. I don't know what the difference between neo-isolationism is and isolationism. One is you withdraw from the world, and the other is you withdraw from the world. But the other would be to go back to pre-World War II multipolarity, where it was all about balancing. much of the sort of balancing that had gone on even in the 19th century in Europe. And he made a case that both of those things would be very bad for the US, and instead we should take a global leadership role. And this the key claim in the report was, or the document was, that he advocated the use of force and even preemptive war if necessary to preserve US global hegemony. And so this is what differentiated the neoconservatives from other conservatives. And it was that document that really became the forerunner for the 2002 and 2006 national security strategies that were embodied in the Bush Doctrine that we talked about last time. So that's the sort of main elements of the neoconservative creed and the history, or the biography of it, if you like. So intellectuals have ideas, but how did they become important in politics? And as with the neoliberal views, it goes back to think tanks. I mentioned to you when we were talking about the resurgence of the Republican right that after the Nixon administration fell apart in the 1970s, there was this emergence of activist think tanks who were committed not to winning the next election, but rethinking the conservative agenda for the medium term, funded by Fulner, Koch, and others in places like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and related conservative think tanks who were mostly interested in domestic politics, particularly rolling back the frontiers of the welfare state. And they got their great moment in 1994 when the Republicans took over the House for the first time in 4 decades, and Newt Gingrich set himself up as a kind of prime minister on Capitol Hill, had Bill Clinton on the run, having lost the midterm elections badly, and that was the opening, and we've been through that, the contract with America and all of that. But there was also a geopolitical rethinking among these people we're talking about now, and I'm calling the neoconservatives. And they were also in think tanks, some of them in not particularly partisan think tanks like the Rand Corporation, which is where that document I just read from came out, and the Council on Foreign Relations, which certainly billed themselves as nonpartisan, even if many people saw them as sort of right of center. But then places like the American Enterprise Institute, which is sort of activist conservative think tanks, people like Pearl were there, and a number of the other neoconservatives spent a lot of time there. And then perhaps most important was a new think tank created in 1997 by Bill Kristol, that's Irving Kristol's son, and Robert Kagan, the son of our colleague, Professor Kagan, here in the history department. And the Project for a New American Century was probably the prime incubator of neoconservatism, and many people who subsequently wound up in the Bush administration spent time there, or passing through these think tanks. And really 9/11 was their moment. 9/11 was the moment at which they realized that there was a huge vacuum in thinking about US strategic policy, and they could go for it. And as I think I mentioned to you last time, by December of 2001, by December of 2000, there were already conversations going on in the, 2001. December of 2001, there were already conversations going on in the White House as to when they could reallocate troops from Afghanistan to Iraq. Now, many people might say, well, why did anybody really want to attack Iraq? It seems something of a puzzle. The neoconservatives had this view about it, but we really have to back into it and look a little bit at the historical background here. So after Saddam Hussein was kicked out of Kuwait in 1991, I described the containment regime that the Bush administration constructed with the no-fly zones and oil for food and all of that, that was essentially meant to hem Saddam Hussein in. They rejected regime change and so on. They rejected externally imposed regime change, but the George Herbert Walker Bush administration was by no means opposed to fomenting the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime. Just didn't want to commit American troops to that. And indeed, one of the things he was greatly criticized for at the time was encouraging the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north to overthrow Saddam Hussein. But when they made those efforts, there was no U.S. backup or support. And that led to the slaughter of many of them by the Ba'athist regime. And beyond that, the CIA, in the years following, spent a lot of time and resources working with opposition groups in Iraq and expatriate groups outside of Iraq to try and engineer the overthrow of that regime, even though it wouldn't involve American boots on the ground. And indeed, there was the creation of something called the Iraqi National Congress, led by a man called Ahmed Shalabi, who was an Iranian expatriate who had been living in London for decades. He had been in Iraq for a very long time. And he worked very closely with the CIA and others to get American indirect support for overthrowing the Iraqi regime. They put together this Iraqi National Congress, which was basically an umbrella organization to try and get all the opposition groups in Iraq together and figure out how to knock off the Saddam Hussein regime. This was formed in 1992. By 1994, it was falling apart in acrimony. The two Kurd groups were fighting over the control of different parts of the country, mostly having to do with oil, and some of them were actually working with Saddam Hussein's regime. Chalabi convinced the U.S. nonetheless to persist with a kind of remnants of the Iraqi National Congress, which he headed and ultimately became a political party in the new Iraq. And he convinced the U.S., the Clinton administration in 1995 to sponsor an attempt at overthrowing a sort of Clinton's, I guess, a little underpublicized, but Clinton's kind of Bay of Pigs, in that Chalabi predicted and promised that as soon as this got going, the Iraqi military would welcome it and they would overthrow Saddam and we would liberate Iraq. It didn't. It was quickly put down. 100 people were executed, many more imprisoned. But it didn't end the love affair between the Clinton administration and particularly the neoconservatives in these think tanks and Ahmad Chalabi, who constantly worked to raise money and to get support for overthrowing the regime. However, the Clinton administration wasn't that interested in this. It was basically being dragged along by the conservatives who now controlled Congress after 1994. Clinton was basically enforcing the containment regime that his predecessor had put in place. So, for example, in December of 1998, there were 3 days of bombing Saddam Hussein, which he described as follows.
3 days ago, despite clear warnings from the United States and the international community, Iraqi forces attacked and seized the Kurdish-controlled city of Erbil in northern Iraq. The limited withdrawals announced by Iraq do not change the reality. Saddam Hussein's army today controls Erbil, and Iraqi units remain deployed for further attacks. These acts demand a strong response, and they have received one. Earlier today, I ordered American forces to strike Iraq. Our missiles sent the following message to Saddam Hussein: when you abuse your own people or threaten your neighbors, you must pay a price. Our objectives are limited but clear: to make Saddam pay a price for the latest act of brutality, reducing his ability to threaten his neighbors and America's interests. First, we are extending the no-fly zone in southern Iraq. This will deny Saddam control of Iraqi airspace from the Kuwaiti border to the southern suburbs of Baghdad, and significantly restrict Iraq's ability to conduct offensive operations in the region. Second, to protect the safety of our aircraft enforcing this no-fly zone, our cruise missile struck Saddam's air defense capabilities in southern Iraq. Saddam Hussein's objectives may change, but his methods are always the same: violence and aggression against the Kurds, against other ethnic minorities, against Iraq's neighbors. Our answer to that recklessness must be strong and immediate, as President Bush demonstrated in Operation Desert Storm, as we showed 2 years ago when Iraq massed its forces on Kuwait's border, and as we showed again today. We must make it clear that reckless acts have consequences, or those acts will increase. We must reduce Iraq's ability to strike out at its neighbors, and we must increase America's ability to contain Iraq over the long run.
So there you see he's speaking the language of containment. They called it aggressive containment. Was the sort of policy he's talking about in that clip. But the neoconservatives weren't happy with aggressive containment. They thought, you might think of them as the latter-day proponents of rollback. Indeed, as I mentioned last week, the Bush doctrine was really about rollback of aggression of any sort to anywhere in the world at the time of America's choosing. So the neoconservatives weren't happy with aggressive containment, and pushed the passage of something called the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998. And the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, just to give you some sense of how much the Democrats here were either on the run or lacking in an alternative conception of their own, a point to which I will return, that the act passed 360 to 38 in the House and by unanimous consent in the Senate. And that act declared that it was the policy of the United States to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein. So clear commitment of the United States government to overthrowing the regime. It authorized $87 million to support 7 designated groups, and it created the opportunity to support more of them, although the clear beneficiary that everyone had in mind was the Iraqi National Congress. And this would be cited by the Bush administration in 2002 in justification of the upcoming invasion. But let's just parse the Iraq Liberation Act a little more closely again by watching Bill Clinton that same day a little later that same day than the earlier clip I showed you.
This crisis also demonstrates, unfortunately, once again, that Saddam Hussein remains an impediment to the well-being of his people and a threat to the peace of his region and the security of the world. We will continue to contain the threat that he poses by working for the elimination of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction capability under UNSCOM, enforcing the sanctions in the no-fly zone, responding firmly to any Iraqi provocations. However, Over the long term, the best way to address that threat is through a government in Baghdad, a new government that is committed to represent and respect its people, not repress them, that is committed to peace in the region. Over the past year, we have deepened our engagement with the forces of change in Iraq, reconciling the two largest Kurdish opposition groups, beginning broadcasts of a radio-free Iraq throughout the country. We will intensify that effort, working with Congress to implement the Iraq Liberation Act, which was recently passed, strengthening our political support to make sure the opposition, or to do what we can to make the opposition, a more effective voice for the aspirations of the Iraqi people.
So there you can see he's still talking the language of containment, even while addressing the Iraqi Liberation Act. Notice the date, the date's a significant one, December 19th, 1998, and it explains the kind of deer caught in the headlights look on Bill Clinton's face, because that was the day that the House voted to impeach him. So he was not a happy camper, one might say, on that day while making that speech. So this was the tussle that went on toward the end of the administration. And the Clinton administration was never, ever contemplating actually going in and overthrowing. In fact, of the $87 million, only $8 was ever allocated by the end of the administration. So they were largely going through the motions, and he was running scared of the Republicans in Congress. And so what happens after that is that these ideas are all, rolling around in the conservative think tanks and being pushed by Chalabi, but they're not really making their way into, as you see, they didn't make their way into the political campaign of George W. Bush. And when 9/11 came along, they thought, this is our moment. And it was their moment. And it was then produced a huge conflict within the administration, because on the one hand, you had the Pentagon, largely allied with Chalabi, who wanted to go in, but the State Department and the CIA were strongly opposed to going in. And indeed, they said that most of the intelligence that they saw, if not all of it, did not show any connection between Saddam Hussein's regime and 9/11, or that there was any active program of building weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which were two of the war aims most commonly cited in the quest to go into Iraq. In the Pentagon, on the other hand, is where the neoconservatives were. And they were working with intelligence that was largely provided for them by Chalabi, which turned out later not to be fake news. This was the fight that was going on, and that once 9/11 occurred, the Pentagon people and the neoconservatives basically got into the driver's seat and took over, partly because both Rumsfeld and Cheney were sympathetic to their goals and already in the administration. And so we had this invasion of Iraq that was a colossal catastrophe for America. It was a colossal catastrophe on a number of fronts. And I would say that, just to give some statistics, first of all, in terms of U.S. casualties, almost, it should be 4,970, I'll fix that slide, almost 5,000 killed, 32,000 wounded. Between 150,000 and 600,000 Iraqis, I'll fix that too, killed, depending on which estimates you go with. They had given as one of the reasons the cost of for going into the war was that the cost of containment. But of course it was nickels and dimes compared to the 1.9 trillion that the CBO was predicting the war would cost in 2007. And our colleague Bill Nordhaus has a paper estimating the cost in excess of $3 trillion. So the financial cost was just enormous. It was a massive display of American weakness. And this is why I mentioned the date before the invasion as the key date, if you want to pinpoint the high point of American influence in the region. It was a massive display of American weakness in two senses. One was that the U.S. couldn't, in fact, the U.S. couldn't win this war in any sense of that would enable them to live up to the mission accomplished that George Bush had announced on May 1st. So what they conflated was the capacity to destroy a country's army with the capacity to actually pacify and govern a country, to win a peace, if you like. And so they put in a barely competent general very early on, and he couldn't run the country. They replaced him with Paul Bremer, a neoconservative, and he began by disbanding the Iraqi army and officer corps in particular, because they were Sunni and the majority of the population were Shiite, and disbanding the Iraqi civil service because out of fear that they might be loyal to Saddam Hussein, and so it effectively created a failed state that descended into civil war. They discovered that their investment in Ahmad Shalabi had been extremely ill-conceived, because not only did he give them bad intelligence, and as he had been doing all the way back to 1995 in the Clinton administration, he predicted that the Americans would be greeted with flowers in the streets, and that we would have no difficulty creating a democracy in Iraq. And interestingly enough, they immediately appointed him president of the Transitional Governing Council in Iraq. But when the 2005 elections were finally held, they had by then appointed him deputy president or deputy prime minister and minister of oil. He didn't even win a seat in the elections, and so he had to leave the government. And he subsequently became involved in a variety of corrupt schemes and fell out of favor with the Americans, and finally died, I believe, in 2015. So it was a massive display of American weakness in that sense as well. And it's a lesson that proponents of rollback fail to learn again and again and again, that I mentioned to you last week, which is that you can destroy a country's army perhaps, but destroying people's capacity to fight when they have everything at stake and you're fighting an elective war is a very tough proposition. So this massive display of American weakness, the domino theory didn't work. Not only were we not getting democracy of any functioning sort in Iraq, but it was not spreading elsewhere in the Middle East. And you might wonder to yourself, why? Why would the neoconservatives believe you could create democracies in these countries that had no history of democracy? And I think that the puzzle there is less difficult to understand if you think back to what they were looking at. What they were looking at was Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism. All of those countries that had been occupied by the Soviets had been occupied by the Soviets and then run by Soviet puppet regimes. As soon as the Soviets fell apart, they all, democracy sprang up. There wasn't any difficulty in getting democracy installed across Eastern Europe. And so they thought, well, that's what happens. You get rid of the oppressive dictator and you create a democracy and everything will be hunky-dory. And not only that, those democracies in Eastern Europe were largely pro-American. And so the conflation of creating a democracy and having a pro-American regime, you might say, is understandable. What they were ignorant of, I think, was several things. And they would have had much better clues if instead of looking at Eastern Europe, where they were fairly developed, diversified economies everywhere except Albania, that had pre-war histories of democracy in many of them, they should have looked at the Asiatic former republics of the Soviet Union to think about what was likely to happen when the Soviet communist systems disintegrated. And of course there had not been transitions to democracy, and those were countries with much lower per capita income. We know that that's important for democracy. They were undiversified. Countries like Kazakhstan is largely just an oil economy. They had so no diversification. If they had a high per capita income, it was oil-cursed high per capita income, so it was undiversified economy. We know that's not propitious for democracy either. So for all of these reasons, it was really pie in the sky to believe that you could just get democracy to spring up. And indeed, if you think back to the two most successful cases of externally imposing democracy on a country, we have to go back to this post-World War II, West Germany and Japan, which were very unusual for a number of reasons. One was that the populations themselves blamed their prior regimes for bringing disaster upon them. Right? In 2003 in Iraq, the Iraqi population did not blame Saddam Hussein for the American invasion, whereas the Germans and Japanese had started aggressive wars, and so they recognized they had themselves to blame. They were occupied for decades by either occupying forces or hovering forces. They were protected by the U.S. umbrella during the Cold War. They were supported economically by the Marshall Plan, and of course, they had favorable demographics for reasons I talked to you about some lectures ago. So none of these conditions were remotely present in the countries in the Middle East that the Bush administration was hoping for and the neoconservatives were hoping would produce a domino effect of successful pro-Western democracies across the region. So all of these were costs of the invasion of Iraq. But perhaps the greatest cost of the invasion was a loss of moral high ground on the global stage.
Last month, the U.S. Army announced 17 soldiers in Iraq, including a brigadier general, had been removed from duty after charges of mistreating Iraqi prisoners. But the details of what happened have been kept secret until now. It turns out photographs surfaced showing American soldiers abusing and humiliating Iraqi prisoners at a prison near Baghdad. Americans did this to an Iraqi prisoner. According to the U.S. Army, the man was told to stand on a box with his head covered, with wires attached to his hands. He was told that if he fell off the box, he would be electrocuted. Abu Ghraib prison under Saddam Hussein was infamous. For decades, many who were taken here never came out. And those prisoners who did make it out told nightmarish tales of torture beyond imagining and executions without reason. Abu Ghraib was the centerpiece of Saddam's empire of fear. We talked about the prison and shared pictures of what Americans did there with two men who have extensive interrogation experience, former U.S. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Bill Cowan and former CIA Bureau Chief Bob Baer.
I visited Abu Ghraib a couple days after it was liberated. It was the most awful sight I've ever seen. And I said, if there's ever a reason we want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, it's because of Abu Ghraib. There are bodies that were eaten by dogs, torture, electrodes coming out of walls, scratches on the wall. It was an awful place.
We went into Iraq to stop things like this from happening, and indeed here they are happening under our tutelage.
It was American soldiers serving as military police at Abu Ghraib who took these pictures. The investigation started when one soldier got them from a friend and gave them to his commanders. We have a dozen of them. There are many, many more. The pictures show Americans, men and women, in military uniforms, posing with naked Iraqi prisoners. There are shots of the prisoners stacked in a pyramid, one with a slur written on his skin in English. In some, the male prisoners are positioned to simulate sex with each other. And in most of the pictures, the Americans are laughing, posing, pointing, or giving the camera a thumbs up. One of the soldiers facing court-martial is Army Reserve Staff Sergeant Chip Frederick. He is charged with maltreatment for allegedly participating in setting up this photo and for posing in a photograph sitting on top of a detainee. Sergeant Frederick is also charged with an indecent act for observing this scene. He is charged with assault for allegedly striking detainees and ordering detainees to strike each other. Sergeant Frederick's letters and email messages home offer clues to problems inside the prison. Frederick wrote that he was helping the interrogators. Quote, "Military intelligence has encouraged and told us great job. They usually don't allow others to watch them interrogate, but since they like the way I run the prison, they've made an exception. We help getting them to talk with the way we handle them. We've had a very high rate with our style of getting them to break. They usually end up breaking within hours." According to the Army's own investigation, that's what was happening. The Army found that interrogators asked reservists working in the prison to prepare the Iraqi detainees, physically and mentally, for questioning. Attorney Gary Myers and a judge advocate in Iraq are defending Chip Frederick. They say he should never have been charged because of the failure of his commanders to provide proper training and standards. How could such a person, described almost universally by people who know him as a good guy, get himself into this kind of jam?
The elixir of power, the elixir of believing that you're helping the CIA, for God's sake, when you're from a small town in Virginia, it's intoxicating. And so good guys sometimes do things believing that they are being of assistance and helping a just cause and helping people who they view as important.
Sergeant Frederick says he didn't see a copy of the Geneva Convention rules for handling prisoners of war until after he was charged. The Army investigation confirms that soldiers at Abu Ghraib were not trained at all in Geneva Convention rule. Frederick says there were far too few soldiers there for the number of prisoners. About how many prisoners were there?
There was, when I left, there was over 900. And there was only 5 soldiers plus 2 non-commissioned officers in charge for those over 900 inmates.
That may have been a contributing factor, but at the end of the day, this is probably more about leadership, supervision, setting standards, abiding by the Army values, and understanding what's right, and having the guts to say what's right.
I see a lot of work going on out here now. We're changing everything.
This is Brigadier General Janice Karpinski, who ran Abu Ghraib for the Army. She was also in charge of 3 other Army prison facilities housing thousands of Iraqi inmates. The Army investigation determined that her lack of leadership and clear standards led to problems system-wide. General Karpinski talked with 60 Minutes' Steve Croft last October at Abu Ghraib before any of this came out.
This is international standards. It's the best care available in a prison facility.
But the Army's own investigation found serious problems behind the scenes. The Army has photographs that show a detainee with wires attached to his genitals, and another that shows a dog attacking an Iraqi prisoner. Were dogs ever used on the inmates?
Yes, sir. They were used for intimidation factors.
And then there is this picture of an Iraqi man who appears to be dead and badly beaten.
Dan, I'd like to sit here and say these are the only prisoner abuse cases that we're aware of, but we know that there have been some other ones since we've been here in Iraq.
When Saddam Hussein ran this prison, Iraqis were too afraid to come to Abu Ghraib and ask for information on their family members. When we were there last month, hundreds had gathered outside the gates, worried about what's going on inside.
We will be paid back for this. These people at some point will be let out. Their families are going to know, their friends are going to know.
This is a hard story to have to tell when Americans are fighting and dying in Iraq.
So it's hard to overstate the shock that caused at home. But the biggest cost, I think, of Abu Ghraib was not at home, but it was the loss of the moral high ground that the U.S. had enjoyed until that time across the region. If you look at the polling about, across much of the Middle East about perceptions of the U.S. during this period, I describe it in the reading that I assigned for today, it fell off a cliff. And the notion that, that the U.S. was in some sense bringing a better world and had different kinds of practices was a sort of flagrant violation of Kennan's dictum that we should not behave in the way that our adversaries behave, and that the long-term strategy of containment is for the hearts and minds of people in the countries that are being contained. And of course, the fact that this was all exposed I think it was initially this 60 Minutes report was in April of 2004, but the following month Seymour Hersh published a huge expose in the New Yorker where he had gotten hold of the Army's report, which you saw referred to in that clip, which revealed that they had known about what was going on in Abu Ghraib and a number of other prisons for many months. And the story just didn't get any better. What turned out to be the case in terms of prosecutions were minimal. The general you saw there was busted back to a colonel. There were some other disciplinary actions of officers. Nobody above the rank of staff sergeant was convicted of any criminal offense, and only I think it was 7 or 8 people had any kind of criminal convictions, the highest being a 10-year sentence. So the perception was that, that the U.S. had allowed the same kind of abominable practices that Saddam Hussein had engaged in, and as I said, the cost in terms of loss of moral high ground is probably incalculable to this day. What made it even worse was that President Bush announced that the prison would be closed the following year, which was not done. And in fact, it wasn't closed until after the Americans left. A decade later, it was closed by the Iraqis. So this combination of the demonstration of American weakness and the loss of any kind of claim to be acting in defense of humanitarian ideals was destroyed. In a geostrategic sense, though, I think the biggest cost, and some might in some sense call it a benefit, of the Iraq debacle, was it was a clear demonstration that the Bush doctrine was unsustainable. because the idea that you could go around the world knocking off regimes, this is the neoconservative regime, the neoconservative dream, turns out to be a nightmare, because you go around the world knocking off regimes unless you have the propitious circumstances and the kinds of investments that we made in Germany and Japan after World War II. The high probability is you're going to get the sort of outcome that we saw in Iraq. And so the Bush doctrine, particularly given that it's being prosecuted in an era of cutting back government spending and downsizing the military, as Rumsfeld argued in the clip I showed you at the beginning of last Thursday's lecture, and contracting out more and more military activities, you're not going to be able to go around the world doing the sort of thing we were trying to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, and end up with, as Bush says in the clip I showed you earlier, a clear exit strategy. And indeed, the Bush doctrine was a complete repudiation of the so-called Powell doctrine of you've got to go in with overwhelming force and a clear exit strategy. Instead, it's proxy wars fought on the cheap using expatriates and local militias who have very different agendas than one's own. And this is the result that you shouldn't be surprised to see. But if not the Bush doctrine, what? If not the Bush doctrine, what? Because, the 1995 document from Rand said, well, what are the alternatives here? The alternatives seem to be neo-isolationism, as he called it, going back to a multipolar world where, in an era of nuclear proliferation, that seems very dangerous and costly for the US. So you might say, well, where were the Democrats? We have a democracy here, we have an opposition party, and one would expect that the opposition party would be articulating an alternative vision. And the Democrats, though, were completely on the defensive. So here I should give you a personal anecdote. In September of 2008, I was invited to speak at the Yale Club of Tokyo to a group of alumni. We do that all the time. We're also going to talk about our research. So I answered with 3 possible topics of things I was then working on that I would be willing to speak about. And the answer came back that nobody would be interested in any of them. And what they wanted me to speak about was what the Kerry administration's foreign policy was going to be. This is September of 2004. What the Kerry administration's foreign policy was going to be. So I ended up giving a talk on why there wasn't going to be a Kerry administration. And the central thesis of that talk was you can't beat something with nothing. And the reality here, you can see if you now go back over the lecture that I've just given you, you can see the clues that the Democrats really had no alternative. First of all, think about that vote of the Iraq Liberation Act. I said it was only 50 or 60 votes against it in the House, unanimous consent in the Senate, and Clinton signs it into law in the midst of his impeachment hearings. The $87 million that I mentioned to you that they authorized for spending on opposition forces in Iraq, that is the famous $87 million that Kerry was later got into trouble for saying, well, I voted for the $87 million before I voted against it, and was used in ads against him by President Bush when he was running for re-election that year. And if you look at the votes to authorize the war, Kerry had voted for the authorization of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, as had, by the way, Hillary Clinton. And so basically what was going on was that the Democrats were playing a game of triangulation. And as we saw when we talked about the anti-tax movement in domestic politics, the trouble with triangulation is that it's good tactics and it's bad strategy. It's good tactics because if you move towards your opponent's position, they will, you can peel off some of their support, and people on your flank really have no place to go. That was the theory behind it. But the reason it's bad strategy is that once your opponent figures out that this is what you're doing, their incentive is to move the goalposts. And so in effect, the Republicans, and particularly the neoconservatives within the Republican Party, had the Democrats on the run because they were playing triangulation to catch up to this target that was moving steadily in a neoconservative direction. The same thing happened as happened with the anti-tax movement, where the Democrats by 2001 found themselves voting for tax cuts that nobody would have taken seriously even 6 or 7 years before, such as the repeal of the estate tax. So the Democrats lacked any alternative geopolitical strategy to the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine filled a void, and they just ran with it. And so one might think that once 2008 rolled around and the Democrats were again in control, things might have played out differently. But we'll see next time that that's not how history played out. We'll see you then.